Hey everybody, this video is called They've Got the Ark, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of 1 Samuel. We're going to be looking at the 4th chapter where we're going to take a look at the capture of the Ark of the Covenant. And so 1 Samuel 4 verse 1 and 2 says, "And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines and was encamped beside Ebenezer, and the Philistines encamped in Aphek. Then the Philistines put themselves in battle array against Israel, and when they joined battle, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men of the army in the field." So we see that Samuel has become a spokesperson or a representative ambassador for God here. And we see that Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who had just better military equipment and things that could protect their troops better, such as helmets and shields and swords and spears. And the Philistines were immigrant people of the island of Crete, as Amos 9:7 says, the Philistines from Kaftor. And verse 3 and 4 says, "And when the people had come into the camp, the elders of Israel said, 'Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord from Shiloh to us, that when it comes among us, it may save us from the hand of our enemies.' So the people sent to Shiloh, that they might bring from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God." So the questions of the elders reflected their knowledge that the Lord had brought these battles and that the Lord had allowed these defeats of them. And when defeated, God wasn't with them, as seen back in Numbers 14:42, which we studied at the beginning of the year, in Deuteronomy 1:42, which we were back in February. And instead of inquiring for the direction from the Lord, they proceeded to take matters into their own hands. And Israel treated the ark like a good luck charm rather than the holy appearance that they should have had with it. And the ark symbolized God's presence and power, and it would ensure them victory over the Philistines. And knowing that victory or defeat depended on the Lord's presence, they confused the symbol of his presence with his actual presence. And in this way, their understanding of God resembled that of the Philistines. And to dwell between the cherubim was a repeated phrase used to describe the Lord in 2 Samuel 6, verse 2, which we'll see in November, 2 Kings 19:15, 1 Chronicles 13:6, Psalm 80 verse 1, Psalm 99 verse 1, and Isaiah 37 verse 16. And it spoke of his sovereign majesty. And we run into the wicked sons of Eli once again too. We have to see their names again. And not only did they trust in the ark, they allowed the priest to serve and carry it who had forsaken the Lord. And verse 5 says, "And when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel shouted so loudly that the earth shook." So we see that Israel made noise for it, nothing, as it was granted in God's truth. And Israel thought, and they acted like pagans, thinking that they could manipulate God and force him to doing what they wanted him to do. And it's some types of Christian denominations today. They manipulate God, and they think that God is their genie, that God needs to do what they tell God to do. And for those people, I challenge you to read Romans chapter 9. And verse 6 through 9 says, "Now when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, 'What does the sound of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews mean?' Then they understood that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp. So the Philistines were afraid, For they said, God has come into the camp. And they said, woe to us, for such a thing has never happened before. Woe to us! Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. Be strong and conduct yourselves like men, you Philistines, that you do not become servants of the Hebrews as they have been to you. Conduct yourselves like men and fight. So the Hebrews were physical descendants of Abraham, and Abram was a descendant of Eber. And the idol to the Philistine was thought to be the actual dwelling place of his deity. So when Israel brought the ark into the camp, the Philistines concluded that God was present in an exclamation that reflected a knowledge of God's power. And evidently, the news of God's victory over the Egyptians was common knowledge within the Philistine people. And Israel's failure to uproot all the inhabitants of Canaan caused them to fall under God's judgment, as we looked at back in July when we studied Judges, specifically Judges 1:28. And later in chapter 10, we're going to see the consequence of this judgment, as Israel is going to be enslaved to Philistine oppression. And the Philistines feared that they would become servants of the Hebrews. In verse 10 and 11 says, so the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent. There was a great slaughter, and there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. Also the ark of God was captured. The two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So why was Israel defeated? There's a few things to note. Is the Philistines fought with the courage of desperate men. They didn't have gender confusion among them, any of that stuff. They fought as men. And Israel, number two, depended too much on their method using the Ark of the Covenant, trying to manipulate God. And number three, God did not bless their actions, because God will not bless sin. And in spite of their hopes to manipulate God into giving them the victory, Israel was defeated, and the ark fell into the hands of the Philistines. And the view of having the ark of God being equivalent to having control of God possessed by Israel and then the Philistines is to be contrasted with the power and the providence of God in the remaining narrative. And we see chapter 2 verse 34 and chapter 3 verse 12 fulfilled as Eli's sons die together. And it cost the lives of 30,000 soldiers because the Israelites were knuckleheads. And in the late 1970s, a 5-line inscription was found on a grain giving the Philistine account of the battle of when they captured the ark. And it even mentioned the priest Hophni. So, there's historic artifacts that have been discovered, in the last few decades that proved this chapter happened as real history. And it was the earliest known extra-biblical reference to an Old Testament event. And God dealt with their idolatry of the ark by taking it away for his glory. And many times as part of chastisement, if you have an idol, God's going to take that away from you. In verse 12 through 18 says, then a man of Benjamin ran from the battle line the same day, and came to Shiloh with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. Now when he had came, there was Eli sitting on a seat by the wayside, watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came into the city and told it, all the city cried out. When Eli heard the noise of the outcry, he said, what does the sound of this tumult mean? And the man came quickly and told Eli. Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were so dim he could not see. Then the man said to Eli, I am who came from the battle, and I fled today from the battle line. And he said, what happened to my son? So the messenger answered and said, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has been a great slaughter among the people. Also your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured. Then it happened, when he made the mention of the ark of God, that Eli fell off the seat backward by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. For the man was old and heavy, and he had judged Israel 40 years. So the actions of the man of Benjamin were considered to be universal signs of mourning for the dead, and of natural calamity, as we'll see of Hushai later on in November, December in 2 Samuel 15, verse 32. And one thing I just wanted to point out in verse 18, when it says that his neck was broken and he died, and he was old and heavy. You know, Eli is body shamed in the Bible. He says, you know, he was a heavy guy. But Eli's concern for the ark stands in sharp difference to his earlier actions, where he honored his two sons over honoring the Lord and the Lord's law. And the battle was fought near Aphek, which was about 20 miles plus from Shiloh. And Jewish tradition argues the unnamed messenger from the tribe of Benjamin was a young man named Saul. And it wasn't the news of Israel's loss in battle that killed Eli. It wasn't even the news of the death of his sons that killed Eli, but hearing that the Ark of the Covenant of God had been captured by the Gentiles. And then we see that he falls over and dies. And according to Psalm 78, verse 60 through 64, and Jeremiah 7:9, Jeremiah 26:9, the Philistines went on to destroy the city of Shiloh itself after they had defeated Israel's army. And so to wrap up the chapter here, verse 19 through 22 says, Now his daughter-in-law Phinehas' wife was with child, due to be delivered, and she heard the news of the ark of God being captured, or was captured, and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead. She bowed herself and gave birth, for her labor pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the woman who stood by her said to her, Do not fear, for you have borne a son. But she did not answer, nor did she regard it. Then she named the child Ichabod, saying, The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God had been captured, and because her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. So what a pretty sad ending to this chapter here. And I honestly feel bad for the wife of Phinehas. And she learned of the death of her husband and brother-in-law, and she learns of the death of Eli, her father-in-law, and she learns of the most hurtful thing that happened with the Ark of the Covenant being taken by the enemy. And we see that it causes great distress on her. It probably triggered her pregnancy hormones, all that, and it brought on labor pains, premature delivery. And she named her baby boy Ichabod, meaning that the glory of the Lord has departed Israel. And so to wrap up the sad chapter, we won't spend too much time with a wrap up here. It's sad. But we looked at Israel's defeat before the Philistines, and we saw how the elders of Israel responded with a superstitious trust in the Ark of the Covenant. We see that they had confidence in the Ark of the Covenant. We see that they had confidence thinking that they could manipulate God and turn God into a genie to do what they want. And we saw how the Philistines feared the Ark of the Covenant. We saw the Ark go into battle, and that Israel was defeated worse than before. And they intended to manipulate God, but we see that God is not a genie to be summoned at the will of man as some desire. And those groups that abuse God today and think he's a genie, they're going to find out the hard way themselves. And we saw Eli died after hearing about the loss of the Ark of the Covenant. It really broke his heart. And we saw that the chapter ends with more tragedy among the family of Eli with his daughter-in-law. We see that it affects her labor, and she has pains and goes into labor. And that's going to wrap up this video for today, and we'll be looking next at the Ark of the Covenant, among the Philistines. So I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time for our next study to be announced. God bless.